think there's anything like the appreciation of how much we really do depend on farmers and farming. Do you think that basic connection in people's minds is somehow absent, that they just think the food will somehow magically be in the vast supermarkets?
Absolutely, there is a huge disconnect between food and people thinking that it suddenly arrives on the supermarket shelves by magic, and I think they think farming is a hobby rather than something that actually feeds them. And I think that there is a high expectation for farmers in communities as well, and people don't really understand that it's a really committed job. It's 7 days a week. I mean, we're carving at the moment, it means 24 hours a day you're on duty, and people just don't seem to appreciate what we do, why we do it, and what we mean for the country in particular. And also, if we give up farming in Britain to allow farmers across the world to feed us, we'll have a complete and utter loss of control. And us farmers find that really frightening. And that's why we're out there, because we want to feed the British people. We don't want to give up our farming. If we give up our farming, what will happen to the countryside?
Yeah.
So,
Andrew, to me, this beggars belief.
Yes.
That we could be contemplating a situation where we don't actually grow our own food. I mean, I know it might be a little bit down the line, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but imagine if we're on the on-ramp to a situation where we are just dependent on all of our food coming from elsewhere, just because it's cheap.
I know you're absolutely right, and Liz makes a brilliant point in turning around, and we need to educate people as to what these certain things are, because effectively we're being peddled a lie, if you like, when you're saying you can use the British flag when, it's processed or packaged here, and you can still use the British flag. People will think, well, hang on, we must be homegrown. Well, it's not. And that's the reality. The more you can bring the awareness to people on that sort of basis, I think that's helpful.
Liz, I think there's something very powerful about the farming lobby, so to speak. I think where the British population might turn a deaf ear or a blind eye to certain protests from certain quarters, I think it really resonates with people. When you talk about the farmers, by inclination, a small c conservative group of people, and that when they're in their tractors, not in the fields planting crops or raising livestock, and they're trundling through central London to try and make their voices heard, do you get a sense that the people are behind you, as they have been behind the farmers elsewhere?
We felt absolute love on Monday from the people in London, and all the farmers have really said that. They had people coming up to their tractors, waving. It's Ramadan at the moment, and the people coming out of the mosque came through and jumped all over the tractors and were waving and throwing kisses. And, we actually could cry with the support that we've had from the public, because we're isolated and we're really controlled by DEFRA, who are, and we're put through this red tractor inspection as well, which is incredibly stressful. And to think that our products are ending up on the shelves next to products which don't have to go through any of that farm assurance scheme, and yet we have to go through these massive hoops. It's just so wrong. But then also the public are being misled into thinking they're buying British products when they're not. And so we do feel the British public are behind us, particularly those that feel, connected to the country. And, there's nothing more, I guess, secure, it's about your national security, isn't it, food? Because we do know in the last war, we went down to 30% self-sufficiency when the empire fed us. But now we don't have an empire. And the thought that we could be held to ransom for food is really scary. But in addition to that, the new trade deals, and in particular the CPTPP deal, is a massive threat to British farming. And we really need to ditch these bad trade deals. They're really bad news for us. So we hope that moving forward as we go into the election, there will be more debate around the need to get out of these deals. Even George Eustice, the former DEFRA secretary, has been incredibly critical of these deals, which Liz Truss was at the centre of negotiating very badly. They are the worst deals in history as far as we're concerned as farmers, and we definitely want out of them.
Liz Webster, I can say unashamedly and unabashedly the farmers have my absolute 100% cast iron support, and I will hope you'll stay in touch, because obviously the plight of the British farmers is closest to my heart of all of the farmers around the world. Thank you so much.
Just to give you a quick summary about what Brexit has done to your food and our British farming. Ultimately, as soon as Brexit happened, we left the common agricultural policy. And that meant that the United Kingdom, because of the devolved status, meant that agriculture became actually unfair within the UK market itself. Then, on top of that, we had trade barriers for our exports to our biggest market, to the EU. But for 3.5 years, we didn't have reciprocal checks for anything coming via the EU. And that included products coming from the rest of the world if it was sent via the EU. And those products were able to come in and undercut our British food. And the supermarkets, in their race to provide everybody with cheap food, were choosing the cheaper food over the British food. So farmers were forced to either sell at below the cost of production, so lose money with that, as support for agriculture, for growing food, was removed. The BPS was actually incrementally removed by the English government, not the Welsh, Northern Irish or Scottish governments. And so as a result, this is why a lot of farmers grubbed their apple trees, for instance, because they were offered prices for their apples which were the same as, years ago, and just really didn't warrant them growing and these products, together with the fact that we had a massive labour shortage because of the end of freedom of movement, and the seasonal labour that we have relied on was not able to come and help us. And now farmers have to do costly paperwork to fill out and make applications for visas, and these visas are not flexible like freedom of movement, where someone could come over, do a picking season, go back to Hungary or wherever, and then come back a few months later and work as long as the season is needed. So these things have all meant that farming is in crisis. But together with that, the government decided to call the Agriculture Bill the Agriculture Act, but it's actually an Environment Act. They swapped food as a public good to the environment. So the only way that farmers are incentivised now is to go into an environmental scheme, which is why when you drive around, you'll see that fields are no longer full of crops. They are full of flowers. So these things are meaning that food production in Britain is contracting quite considerably. And now the government have put in the reciprocal checks for imports from the EU. It also means that it's harder to get food in from where we get most of our food from, the EU, and more expensive. So the crisis for food and farming is really, really terrible, and we really need urgency in getting rid of the friction between us and our biggest market. And that is to ensure that we have enough food, because this winter, highly likely, we're going to be looking at real problems with food and more inflation, more food shortages because of these checks. And so we need to get rid of those as quickly as possible. And the Labour Party have said that they will agree a veterinary agreement and they will align with EU regulations. And that will get rid of a lot of the red tape, and that will alleviate the problem. It's not the silver bullet. The silver bullet is getting back in the single market and the customs union, and becoming rejoining the European Union is really the answer for our food system. But until then, going with a veterinary agreement and a alignment with EU regs, non-divergence, will mean that ultimately we'll also have to get out of these bad trade deals which this Conservative government have negotiated, and they've also applied to accede to CPTPP, which has been accepted. We're just waiting for other governments in that deal to ratify Britain's accession, and we really need out of CPTPP, and we need to get out of the bad trade deals. There's nothing worse than a bad deal, and these are the worst deals in history.